Good morning. Welcome again to Morning Devotions, and thank you so much for letting us spend time together as we walk through the Bible. I want to bring you back over to the book of Galatians today because we finish up the book of Galatians. Paul says in Galatians chapter 6, verse 4, each one should test his own actions. Then he can take pride in himself without comparing himself to somebody else. For each one should carry his own load. Let me read you that same verse out of the Phillips translation. He says, let every man learn to properly assess the value of his own work. He can then be glad when he has done something worth doing without depending on the approval of others. Every man must shoulder his own pack. Brothers and sisters, it's very important in life that you and I learn to self-examine ourselves. I showed you this earlier out of the book of 2 Corinthians, and we come back to the same thought again. Now, rather than self-examining our spiritual life, he says, I want you to learn to self-examine your actions, what it is that you're doing, the work of your hands, what it is that you're accomplishing. You need to learn to examine your actions. We're not talking about holiness now. We're not talking about our spiritual life. We're talking about the things that we are accomplishing, our careers, our accomplishment, forgive me, our grades in school. All of our lives we've been taught to compare ourselves with others. But God doesn't do that. God's given each one of us very specific abilities. I was sitting in a meeting the other day with Brother Rene, our CFO, and I can remember when I was in college, I know I'm showing my age here, so be merciful to me, but we were not allowed to use calculators. Calculators were a brand new thing, and when we were studying accounting, we were not allowed to touch a calculator. Instead, the professor would take a blackboard and completely cover it with numbers. And we were expected, as part of our exams, to be able to start at one end and in our head run all the numbers and do all the carrying and get to the end and have the correct answer across the bottom, all in our heads. Now, I used to be able to do that and do it very well. Now, I sit there in meetings and I'm going, Grabe, how do you add this up and how do you multiply this out? I've gotten so dependent on calculators and cell phones, and I don't do it in my head, but he still does it all in his head. And I was sitting there in the meeting just laughing at it, thinking, I'm not as smart as I used to be, am I? And he laughed at me. He said, no, you're just out of practice. See, each one of us, if we're not careful, we start comparing ourselves with other people. Because ever since we were children, we were compared with others. Your Heavenly Father doesn't compare you with anybody else. And your Heavenly Father doesn't want you comparing yourself with anybody else because you are unique. Your talents, your abilities. I may be very logical, but I have the artistic ability of a drunken chicken. I can't even write in a way that people can read it. Other people are beautifully artistic, but they're not very logical. Each person has talents and abilities that God has given them. And each person has things that God has asked them to do. He hasn't asked anybody else to do it. He's asked them to do it. So God looks at a unique person. He says, now listen, I want you to test your actions. Then you can take pride in yourself without comparing yourself to anybody else, because each man should carry his own load. Each man should carry the load in life that God has given to him and that God has given him the ability to do. So brothers and sisters, would you please look in the mirror and stop looking at everybody else? Stop comparing what you have and what you're doing and your accomplishments, and forgive me, even your grades with everybody else. And start looking at yourself and saying, am I doing the best I can do with what God has given me? Am I doing what God has given me to do? Then you can take pride in your own actions.